evening, everyone. It's 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Erin Jakowski. I'm an Associate Dean in the Office of Graduate Studies. And this is our first evening of MFA Thesis Artist Presentations. And this is a first. This is the first time that we've been able to offer this opportunity to graduating thesis students to lecture on your work in the auditorium. And I think as a graduate community, we do recognize its importance for artists to be able to talk about their work. And it's an important skill for being a professional artist. And you've all seen many examples of this throughout your years here of guest artists who've given lectures in your own programs. And now it's your turn. Now it's your turn to present on your work and what concerns and social issues are of interest to you. And I think it's a really important and exciting capstone moment of your educational experience here at MICA, so we're excited to be here. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first student presenter, Samantha Fine, who completed her post-bac certificate in fine art at MICA, and she has her BA in liberal arts from Sarah Lawrence College. She also did a couple semesters abroad studying visual art and art history in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Havana, Cuba. Recent exhibitions include shows at Studio 659 in Whiting, Indiana, curated by Stephanie Madison, the Soho 20 in New York City, and the Hiller Art Space in DC. And when Samantha was asked to describe her work, she wrote, "My artwork explores contemporary psychosocial issues, nonlinear narratives, and absurdist humor."
All right, thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to assume that most of you have seen my thesis show at this point, but if you haven't, it's at the Fox 3 Gallery on the 3rd floor of the Fox building. It's called Tall Tales, and I hope that you'll all attend. I'm going to start this talk by going into a little bit of my personal history, and then I'll talk more about the ideas that I was considering as I began my thesis project. So one thing that's important to note is that I have a strong background in the liberal arts and particularly the social sciences. Between the ages of 19 to 25, so from the time I graduated high school until I came to MICA as a post-baccalaureate student, I was working with high-risk populations in marginalized settings. So this included homeless and drug-addicted adolescents in the Philippines, as well as immigrant day laborers and incarcerated men in New York. And so these years helped me to become really adept at observing, examining, and recording human behavior. And during this period of research, I conducted a number of ethnographic interviews. And so this allowed me to obtain personal narratives from people who are often hidden from the public view. And so once I came to art school, it became really easy for me to take this framework and adopt it into my artistic practice. Thus, I view my artwork as a visual ethnography, and I really see my studio practice as a continuation of these untold complexities that I was pursuing in my sociological research. As I began to consider creating a body of work for thesis, I really wanted to pare everything down and summarize the intent of what I was doing into a single quote. So I finally selected this quote by Nabokov: "The more you love a memory, the stronger and stranger it becomes." And I taped this quote onto the wall of my studio, and I continued to refer to it in the months as I was working on my thesis to help me maintain my focus in terms of what I was doing. And I hope that this quote functions both as a personal guide as I was creating the artwork, as well as a guide for the viewers as they enter the exhibition and help frame the artwork as they view the pieces. I'm interested in the subjectivity of perception and the idea that we all have these internal narratives and this internal storytelling, and that as an event unfolds, we tell it to ourselves over and over again until it solidifies into a facet of our personal history. However, once an experience has occurred, it will never be recalled accurately. Moreover, even when an event is occurring, no two people perceive it the same way because everybody's perception is informed by a number of factors, including their life experiences. So in my pieces, I'm really not interested in trying to create this universal truth or replicate reality. Instead, I'm interested in giving expression to a uniquely individualized reality. The most common question I receive is who the characters in my paintings are, and whether or not they're people I know. And so the answer to this is both yes and no. All of my paintings start with at least a kernel of something that I've experienced or somebody that I know, but then I use this as a departure point. So through the process of creating the painting, which is extremely arduous, I do a number of preparatory studies, drawings, smaller acrylic paintings, and then I do my underpainting in acrylic and then multiple layers of oil. By the time I get around to the actual creation of the piece, I'm detached from the actual events which inspired this piece, and I really allow the characters to take on a life of their own. In this body of work that I exhibited, there's a lot of iconography and images that reference the American Southwest. And the reason for this is that these characters are all based on people that I associate with from my childhood growing up in southern Arizona. So I really wanted to reference the landscape of the Sonoran Desert so that my work could be deeply rooted in place. Another aspect that became crystallized during this process was the use of animals. You're going to see a little bit in this picture that even the hobby horse and stuff like that is creating its own life. Here you can see in this image the goat at the bottom right gazing up at the viewer as though he's commenting on the scene like it's a Greek chorus. So this painting is called The Chase, and it's 8 feet by 6 1/4. My paintings are all really large, and this is for 2 reasons. One, because I tend to work faster when I have a larger canvas, and also because there are so many elements that I wish to incorporate into my narratives that I need the extra space. I draw a lot upon literature in my work, and what I'm really interested is in the idea that I can create my own brand of magical realism. So for instance, in this piece, there's a number of seemingly fantastical elements. There are the skeleton horses. If you look at this detail shot here, there are all these strange little flattened things floating about through space. But my goal in putting these elements into the paintings is not to create fantasy paintings, but rather to bring them into the living realm. So to present them as though they existed within the world, such as a lot of magical realist authors do. Okay, so another thing that I really want to talk about is that my pieces are all very ambiguous. And the reason for that is because in life, my view of life is that very few things are encapsulated into a tidy conclusion. And more often than not, there are a lot of loose ends. So I'm not really interested in creating a linear narrative that ties everything up. And so some of the ambiguities you can see, for instance, in this piece, is that if you follow the rope doesn't actually connect. It's not a real rope that exists in the space. And additionally, the baby, it's either tilted in such a way that you can only see 3 limbs, or it just doesn't have an extra limb. I mean, I really leave it up to you as to how you interpret that. But even my decision to title this piece The Chase, I did intentionally to make it ambiguous. Because there's really, the relationship between the pursuer and the pursued is unclear. For instance, is the woman chasing the baby? Are the skeletons chasing the woman? Is the goat chasing the donkey? Etc. Even though my pieces are ambiguous, I do offer little clues that I sprinkle throughout the piece that serve as symbols for viewers to understand who these people are and what's going on in the narrative. So for instance, in this painting, Mishap, you can see on the bottom in the foreground, there's pieces, shards of glass, broken glasses. In the background, there's a man running, spilling his coffee. And even like these tiny details, such as the figure on the left, pack of cigarettes in her pocket, and I don't know if you can tell on that slide, but she has zebra painted acrylic nails. These all become important components for the overall composition of the narrative. Throughout my graduate career, I've had a tumultuous relationship with painting. And I struggle at times with being called a painter, partially for the fact that I also do these mixed media pieces. So, because painting is such an arduous process for me, when I make these mixed media pieces, it allows me to approach the process of making art in a different way, and it serves to counterbalance all of the weight and baggage that I feel with painting. And so I felt very strongly about including a mixed media piece in my show, because I didn't feel like only showing paintings would be representative to my creative practice or how I view myself as an artist. So this piece is a spinning story wheel. And what I did is I created my own symbology, some of it which I referenced in previous paintings, some of it not. And I gave it this game-like appearance. So you can actually spin the wheel and land on an item. What I did was I placed the wheel outside the gallery before you enter the paintings, because I really wanted to give viewers a sense that these paintings could have developed from spinning the wheel. And perhaps they can contemplate what future paintings could come to pass as you spin the wheel and as you land on these different items. In conclusion, this body of work challenges the notion that the mind gives a reliable account of the lived experience. One of my goals is that viewers will set aside their preconceptions and accept a radically different reality. And I hope that in turn, they will reflect upon themselves and question alternative possibilities of their own experiential history. Any questions? Well, I selected the symbols because they're things that interest me, and because they're things either that have appeared in previous paintings or just something that I found enjoyable to draw. I don't think I would necessarily spin the wheel and arbitrarily create a composition from whatever items it lands on, just because my paintings are so deeply rooted in a specific narrative. But those items could definitely appear in a future painting because they're items that interest me. So, by the way, the color is called Windward, and I felt like it was so, that space actually isn't, where the spinning story wheel isn't painted, but I felt that it was really important to paint the space because I just thought that the white was too much contrast, and the way that the color is, I mean, it's very subtle kind of white-gray, but it has some blue and purple tones, and I thought that that would really help the images pop out. It depends. Some ideas I'll have, like for instance, I have 2 ideas right now that I've had for, well, one of them I've had for several months, and then one of them I've had more recently. But some of them will come to be even as I'm drawing. So through the process of doing all these preparatory sketches, a lot of times, for instance, in my initial drawings of the chase, the baby wasn't in there. That got added in almost last second. Whereas the little, I guess whatever you want to call them, the wingdings in front of the woman's face, that that was the last thing I did on that painting, but the entire time I had known that it was going to be in there. It's definitely something that I struggle with a little bit in terms of balancing the amount of realism versus the amount of distortion. To me, I'm not super interested in creating these incredibly lifelike forms, but I do wish to keep it lifelike to the point where it won't bother the viewer. So if it's so distorted or it looks just so quote unquote wrong that it becomes distracting, then I feel like it needs to be corrected. It's more personal. It tends not to be from that. I think that would probably be, I think that would be too much of like a one-liner. I mean, because in the type, like for instance, the type of research I was doing, like investigating why people use drugs or looking at the social familial factors. I mean, I feel like a painting from that is pretty conclusive and would just be too much of a one-liner. Versus these, and also because I don't see these people over time. With some of the elements that I've chosen, the people who have inspired me for these paintings, I've seen them over time. And I've seen how they've grown and changed, and that becomes interesting for me. All of it plays in, and if anything, I think some of my research and my work in sociology has really shaped my worldview in terms of how I approach a subject. And so all of that stuff to me is very interconnected. And it's not as though, I mean, for the most part with these paintings, it's not as though, oh, here's someone I know and I'm going to paint them. A lot of times it can be composites of various aspects of different people. I mean, because eventually it reaches a point where it's not about whatever it was based on, it's about allowing the characters in the painting to become their own characters. And whether or not that was a mix from other people, or sometimes it just even gets completely invented as I go, and that really becomes what's most important.